Welcome to the True Stories of World War II podcast, where the stories are true and about World War II. I'm your host, Holden, better known on the internet as True Stories of World War II. Our guest today is Mason, better known on the internet as the Milser Mariner. Mason, why don't you introduce yourself?
As Holden said, my name's Mason. I run a relatively small history, firearms, military history page on Instagram. Mostly focuses around British Commonwealth small arms, but I have a smattering of other pieces in my collection that will show up from time to time. I just post run-of-the-mill gun pics, the occasional video, and some other random stuff on my story that loosely pertains to my area of interest.
Awesome. All right, so Milser Mariner is one of my close friends on Instagram, but why I chose to have him on one of his first podcasts is he's actually one of the first Milser history pages that I ran across before I even started True Stories of World War II. So in a way, I guess he's one of the inspirations for my page. So that's pretty cool. Finally get somebody that was one of the inspirations for me to jump into the history world on the podcast, which is pretty interesting. Before we get rolling here, I got some shout outs to give. First of all, I want to shout out the people that sponsored today's podcast. First, I have Surplus and Stuff. He's a great dude. We're going to get him on a podcast next week, I think. And then also Black Sheep 302. He actually sponsored the next 3 podcasts, which is really nice to him. We're going to get him on Saturday. We're going to do some show and tell kind of stuff and maybe talk about some World War II movies. So be looking out for that. If you want a shout out on one of these videos, it's just going to cost you $1. You know, that's all we're looking for. And if you want to give us $5, I'll send you a True Stories of World War II sticker to wherever you are in the world. It's a pretty good deal, honestly, because it cost me like $2 to ship them. So if you want to sponsor us, send me a message on Instagram. All right, you guys have seen the show. You know what's coming next. We're getting right into the controversial questions. Milser Mariner, are you ready for the controversy?
Send it.
He said send it. We're going to jump right into it with probably one of the most controversial questions we have tackled so far. All our listeners at home, I hope you're sitting down. All right. So, Mason, do you believe the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, also known as the regular German army, didn't commit any atrocities? You can blame it all on the SS. What are your thoughts?
What I'm about to say shouldn't be taken out of context. I don't believe in that myth, mostly because no army during any war is clean, be it the side that history decides to pick as the good guys or not. You know, the U.S. Army, they didn't really do some great things in the Pacific. You know, Canadians, and this is a different war, Canadians were not known for doing great things to German prisoners during World War I. Seems that everyone in war is human. Everybody makes mistakes. There's some good people, there's some bad people. And while the SS was kind of at the epicenter of the knowledge of German war atrocities, I feel like there's no true, what's the word?
Innocent parties.
There's no one who's perfect in war.
Right.
Everybody does something regrettable at some point. Be it the Axis, be it Allies.
You know, what I think is really interesting about this myth, it's called the clean Wehrmacht, basically. Like the whole idea that the German army is completely free of blame for anything that happened during World War II. It's been like disproven. Like it's one of those things that like there's proof that the Wehrmacht was just as guilty as the SS for committing war crimes, and there's literally pictures of the Wehrmacht with the SS committing war crimes. But even though it's been proven to not be like valid, there's still people that believe it, and it's still something that's like widely spread. And I think it's kind of a way of like for people in the present day to like remove themselves from World War II a little bit.
Right.
Like, oh, my ancestor, he fought for Germany, but he wasn't SS. He was just a regular army. So, I mean, there's a chance, like, or I mean, it's probably not even a chance. It's probably like a really good odds that your ancestor didn't like participate in some particularly terrible things, but like there's still a chance they did. So like just to like totally discount that just for being Wehrmacht is a little short-sighted, I guess. Maybe it's wishful thinking. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I do agree with the wishful thinking, and I've actually heard this myth from. Yeah, I was on some Facebook Milsurp forum, and I've heard it from a couple German reenactors in that forum, where, and I don't agree with either side. I don't agree with the people who like think that German reenactors are neo-Nazis, and I don't agree with the people who think that like it was just the SS who did all the bad stuff. And I just think it's so strange to hear. It's like, no, yeah, the German army was totally, they were totally blamed for you. It's just this one little portion.
Yeah, I think that the reenacting thing is like a whole nother subject in my book. Like honestly, there's in every like group of World War II like nerds, there's one dude who's a little too into Germany.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? You know those guys. Like you're just like, man, like you're like one like goose step away from being a neo-Nazi, and like I don't even think you're trying. Like,
Yeah.
but I've known multiple people that fit that description, and it's just like, all right, guy, like you got to chill out a little bit on the Nazi Germany stuff. Like,
Yep.
um,
Yeah, I agree with what you said, with people distancing themselves from that. And I mean, I'm not going to call it mature. I'm just going to call it correct historical thinking. I'm like, let's see, let me do some genealogy. I'm about 50% Polish Jew. And, historically speaking, that's not really, they're not really a well-treated group, especially by the Germans in World War II. And there are just some absolute idiots out there who just think it's like, nope, it was just the SS, not the regular German army. It's like, you know what? As a person who can historically trace their roots back to people who are directly oppressed by them, I can like think about it and say it's like, everybody did bad things at one point. It's not just one group. You can't lay the blame all on one group of people.
yeah, and I'm kind of on the opposite side of that, to be honest with you. I have Wehrmacht infantry ancestors who died in Russia during World War II. So I don't have any qualms about what they did. I just like it is what it is. I mean, and I've had this conversation with other people before. Is like it's great to like study ancestry, but like you can't really like take responsibility for what happened before you're born. You kind of just have to like
Oh,
learn.
exactly.
You have to learn from it, but like I don't I don't even want to know like the percentage of Americans that are alive today that have like Nazi relatives. Like it's probably a lot. Like we don't want to know. Like so
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, and there's also the fact that so many people apply modern morals to history, and that's something that can't be done. You can't think of history in a modern standpoint just because what happened happened. There are things that happen in the heat of the moment that maybe now we wouldn't have done, but you can't. You can't change the fact, and you can't blame people for things that happened nearly 100 years ago or 70 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's really valid. And like not only is it like we can't apply like modern standards. It's like we just can't even play like the what if game with history. Like what if this would have happened and what if that would? Well, it didn't. So,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But it's fun to talk about. I mean, that's why I have a career in it. But
right. Yeah.
But yeah, I just tying all this like this whole controversy up is it's really complicated that there's still people out there that believe this myth that the Wehrmacht did nothing wrong because it's been proven that they did. And
yeah, exactly. There's photographic evidence.
It's just a weird hill to die on because it's proven to be true,
Yeah.
Or that the fact that it's not true has been proven to be true, I should say. So I want to switch from Europe over to my area of focus in Asia and talk about the atomic bombs in Japan. I really want to look at this issue that I've seen a lot lately where people are starting to ask the question, why are we so fixated on the atomic bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima when the firebombing of Tokyo actually took more lives in one single attack? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that we think about the atomic bombings more than Tokyo because, I mean, the fire bombings, unfortunately, were nothing new. It was happening in Europe at the same time. And unfortunately, not a lot of people consider that. But the atomic bombs were something new. And it was something that happened in an instant and instantly changed warfare forever. And while both of them caused a catastrophic death toll, the nuclear bombs were just something that was so much newer and such an instantaneous change to everything that had happened before that people kind of forget about the other stuff.
Yeah, I think that's really a really good point. Is like the atomic bombs were so like they are brand new. You know, like there wasn't anything to like compare them to previously. Even though like we estimate 100,000 people died in the firebombing at Tokyo, and only 70,000 people died in Nagasaki and 80,000 died in Hiroshima. It's still like these bombs. It was just like this new. It was a single bomb. You know, it wasn't like this strafing run of
Right.
incinerary bombs. It was one bomb. It wasn't like this mass scale bombing that we'd seen in Tokyo and like Dresden, like we talked about in the last podcast. And I think that's really valid. I mean, it's just this whole like brand new thing. And even though it didn't have like the highest body count, which sounds really morbid saying it like that, but that's really what it was. I mean, they didn't have the highest body count um, of any like attack in the war, and I think sometimes that gets lost in the mud too. Like some people get the idea that these atomic bombs were like the worst thing ever. Um, they were pretty bad, but probably
Yeah,
not like the worst thing ever because they didn't quite have the body count that other single day attacks had. Um, we fixed that in the 50s. We made atomic bombs that were like 1,000 times as bad as the ones that we dropped in Japan, but that's another story.
exactly.
Um, and I think that's why we're so fixated on them, though, is because it was just such a like a brand new like foray into a new kind of way to kill each other.
Yeah.
Um,
Another reason I think that we think about the atomic bombings more is that unlike the development of warships and planes and tanks and other forms of mechanized warfare that took a long time to develop and saw a lot of time on the battlefield, with the nuclear bombs, it's like at first there was nothing and then there was the nuclear bomb. It was just such a new thing that people are all of a sudden, it's like, yeah, this is game changing. All the other stuff is kind of old, run of the mill. You know, fire bombings happened during the war, but the nuclear bombings, it's just such a different thing that it just kind of defines the late war period, especially in the Pacific.
that's fair. And I always want to add my disclaimer when we're talking about civilian casualties in war. I don't condone civilian casualties, and the atomic bombs are like particularly like touchy subjects to a lot of people. Um, but I think it's we're still talking about it today because there's still this question of like whether or not it was justified to drop them. Why are we so fixated on them when worse stuff happened? And I guess that's kind of like leading into my next question. Um, why do we view the atomic bombs as what like really ended the war in Japan when they really weren't? You know, what really ended the war in Japan is the Russians showed up. And previously, Japan had hoped that the Russians were going to hold the U.S. at bay. That didn't really happen. Obviously, the Russians they they showed up in the Pacific, coincidentally the same time frame that the Japan surrendered. But in the U.S., we'd like to think that Japan surrendered because we dropped a couple atomic bombs. Do you,
Right.
do you think that's just kind of like this U.S. like supremacy idea that we have? Like we'd really like to think that it was us that finished the war, or is there more to the story?
I think a lot of it is, yeah, just rampant American nationalism, which I mean, I'm as red blooded American as it gets, but like all like the back to back World War champion shirts and bumper stickers just for some reason annoy the piss out of me. And I'm not entirely sure why, but I think we think about the nuclear bombs ending the war. Like I said in the last point, it's just something that's, you can draw it to one exact point. With the Russians arriving in the Pacific, it was kind of like, I don't want to say a trickle in, but it wasn't as instant as the nuclear bombs. And with the proximity that they happen to each other, one of them can kind of get brushed under the carpet in lieu of the other one being a much more catalyzing event.
Fair. And I just want to make the point too that I'm about as red-blooded American as they come too. I mean, I was a sergeant in the Marine Corps. I kind of take crap for kicking the U.S. every once in a while, but it's kind of just I like honest history, you know, and I don't think that this over patriotized history is honest history sometimes. It's just like
Exactly.
our patriotism in the United States is almost like a civil religion to the point
Yeah.
like we worship like America world dominance when I don't always think it should be praised quite as much. You know, the whole idea of playing like world police, which is like the American diplomatic strategy today, it's a little overplayed and a little like overhyped, to be honest. Um,
Yep.
I really I tend to think that like the reason though that we're taught in school that like the atomic bombs ended the war, it really has a lot to do with like the whole Cold War thing. Like we immediately just get into this like 40-year, 50-year stalemate with Russia following World War II. So we don't really want to admit that the Russians basically won the war in Europe. So why would we want to admit that they basically won the war in Asia?
Exactly. Yeah. That's a good way to think about it too. That's a really good way to think about it.
Yeah, and I mean I don't always agree with all the Russian hate either, but that's another
Yeah.
story. Um, I don't have a ton like more to say about the atomic bombings in Japan and like American supremacy, but I always like to funnel back to the point where whenever I'm talking about the atomic bombs is like um, if we did drop the bombs, there's a chance that a lot more people would have died
Exactly.
in a land invasion of Japan. So like however like controversial the bombing is in Japan, a land invasion most likely would have cost a lot more civilian lives.
Yeah.
Um, and
And
that's really
that'll go back to the war atrocities that were discussed earlier. Like, I mean, Japan was arming every man, woman, and child with whatever they could. And
right.
if some super excited U.S. serviceman was seeing a bunch of Japanese coming at them with swords and sticks, and he had like, I don't know, was sitting behind a 1919 machine gun or something. I mean, if he had a bunch of guys like that, that could have ended up with a lot more controversy than the two atomic bombs.
Right. And I've talked about this before on other podcasts and probably some Instagram lives where when we actually got to mainland Japan, like we found warehouses that were like full of like sharpened sticks, basically. It's like, so we kind of had like an idea that like the Japanese citizens weren't going to like give up mainland Japan without like hand to hand, like fight to the death, basically. And
Yep.
actually, like some of those sticks are like some of like the most expensive like Japanese war relics
No, exactly.
because they like burned these warehouses when they got there. So if anybody has like ones that have like provenance, like they can prove that are actually like from there, they're actually like super expensive relics. But
Yeah, exactly. It's like the late war, like last ditch Type 99 rifles. Like, I mean, they're fine rifles. They're not really shooters, but they just go for an insane amount of money just because that last ditch provenance they have behind them.
yeah, I have a last ditch one, but it's not as crude as some of them. Um,
I've
it
seen
ha-
some ridiculously crude ones.
yeah, it has the wooden butt plate, the tacked together bolt, unfinished metal, unfinished wood, but it's it's not as bad as some of them I'm seeing. Like there's ones that were made like the day before the empire collapsed. So
Yeah. And sometimes you got to think about these things like, and this is kind of wandering off topic, like the Arasaka family rifles are extremely well made. And if these things are being designed to be combat rifles and you can still make the same combat rifle in that rushed of a manner, the people that are going to be using are probably just going to fight just as good as that rifle is. And that's pretty insane to me.
Yeah. Don't get me started on Arasakas. I love them.
Yeah.
I love the impracticability of anti-aircraft sights on the early ones. Like I love the concept there. Yeah, and you know what I don't see much of though is the late war K98s. Like you don't see a lot of people talking about those, but they're like almost as equally as crude as the late war
Oh yeah.
Arasakas.
Yeah, I saw one come up on Gunbroker that was listed as a sporterized Mauser. It's like, no, it's not sporterized. It just wasn't built all the way.
Yeah, I've never handled one ever. I've handled a lot of guns, and I've never handled a late war K98. I guess that's on the bucket list.
Yep, I haven't either.
So I want to move on to our next controversial topic. I think we've already kind of touched on it in this answer, and it's the whole idea of, do you agree with the statement that the U.S. saved the day in World War II? And I think this really gets into that whole idea of like U.S. supremacy.
I partially agree with it. It's not like the U.S. fought every single battle and won every single battle either. But you do have to recognize that the U.S. had a very appreciable effect on the war, mostly because we were a huge manufacturing giant in the war. Like even before we entered the war, we were supplying Britain with not most of their arms and ammunition, but a good amount of it. Plus our merchant fleet was really pulling their weight in the Battle of the Atlantic, really keeping Britain afloat with supplies, both for civilians and military. But I don't agree with the fact it's pretty popular in the media and in most relatively uneducated, in at least a history sense, uneducated people's minds that the war started in 1941 and the U.S. ended in 1945. That's the part I don't agree with.
Right, and I think that's fair, because by the time the United States had officially entered the war, it had been going on for 2 years. That war started in 1939. Depending on who you ask, it might have started in 1937 in Asia.
Yep.
But I also like what you was talking about, the Lend-Lease program. I tend to think like the U.S. like production, it wasn't just covering for the U.S. in World War II. We were supplying the British and the Free French and the Chinese and anybody else who needed supplies, Russia, that always kind of blows my mind. The U.S. was supplying Russia with supplies during World War II, but that we were
Yep.
actually a lot of Jeeps.
Yep.
But
it's always interesting to see, Sherman tanks in the hands of both Russians and British. I mean, like, it's just so weird. Like, you see pictures of them on the internet, and they're like, "Oh, those Americans are wearing the wrong helmets," and it's like, well, the fact is that they're not Americans; they're just using American equipment.
Yeah. I posted a picture a while back on Instagram. I can't remember which plane it was, but there was a line of planes, like 5 or 6 of them, and they were all U.S. manufactured, but they were marked up for like 6 different countries.
Yep.
Which I don't know. So like I'm kind of with you. Like I'm like back and forth like on this idea that the U.S. saved the day. Like I think the U.S. manufacturing had a lot to do with success in World War II. Considering we were making things like Enfields and Mosins, things that like you'd be pretty hard to debate didn't really have a huge contribution. But like at the same time, it's like by the time the U.S. had got to Europe, I mean, the war had been going on for 2 years, so it's kind of hard to say like, the U.S. we came in there and we cleaned up. Well, it took 4 more years after we like decided to enter the war, right? Like it wasn't like an overnight success. Like I like the World War I song, over there. I don't know if you're
Yeah.
familiar with it, but it's like
Yes,
this
I
over enthusiastic, like American, like uh, the Yanks are coming and we're not coming home till it's over there. Like
Yep.
it's a little more complicated than that, you know. Like we're still
Yeah.
there. We're still
Yeah.
there. Like
Yeah.
it's been over since 1945, and we're still there. Like
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's still, um, and this is a Cold War thing too, but there's still, you know, Army and Air Force bases in Italy and Germany and France that have been there since the 40s.
yeah. Well, I spent 2 years on Okinawa, so in Japan. So yeah, I'm well aware we're still occupying places since the 1940s. That was my first station in the Marine Corps. It was 2 years in Okinawa, which is about 1,000 miles south of mainland Japan in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah. I go to school with a guy who was he was a bosun's mate on a minesweeper. I think also out of Okinawa. Pretty sure it was Okinawa. Yeah, somewhere, some Japanese island, but I'm pretty sure it was Okinawa. But yeah.
Yeah, we still have huge troop buildups there and in Germany. And I think recently Trump said we're going to bring people home from Germany. I'll believe it when I see it. I mean, that those bases, they went through like peaks and valleys. Like there was a ton of service members there in like the 80s and 90s, and it's kind of like waned back now that we're not fighting like full-on wars in the Middle East. But you could argue that we've been occupying Europe since World War II. I mean, like
Yeah.
it's still like ongoing, you know. But
Yeah. I mean, I'd argue that any military presence is technically an occupation.
yeah, I would too. We have even more complicated military presence, like our presence in Cuba. Like, I explained that one to me. I have no idea how we've maintained a military base in Cuba through like 50 years of a Castro regime.
Yeah.
But all right, we kind of got away from is the USA of the day. I think the real answer here is well, sort of. And when we say well, sort of, we're really talking about manufactured goods, not necessarily brute force. If you're looking for brute force, see Russia in the
Soviet
dictionary.
Union. Yeah.
The method of we'll just throw people at the problem until the problem goes away. Never mind the body count. You don't need a rifle. You'll be just fine. AKA Joseph Stalin. All right.
Yeah. I mean, I will never support communism or the Soviet Union, but like, if you need someone to fight a war against another super nasty regime, the Soviet Union is the one who's going to win it.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons, and I mean, there's just like this. Soviets are so used to their life being awful that like they have the upper hand, and they have this like insane population. Like like you can't even like compare it to like the countries they were fighting against. So,
oh, exactly. Yeah, they could just like, unlike Germany, who was breaking out the Volkssturm later in the war, the Soviet Union just kept pumping and pumping out new troops to the Eastern Front.
Yeah, honestly, I think some of like the worst images from like the war in Europe are when the Soviets finally take Berlin and they're fighting like kids, basically.
Oh, it's awful. Yeah, especially what they did to like some of that really, really old, almost medieval era architecture. Those pictures actually make me really sad. Like I can't remember the Reichstag, I think. What they did to the inside of it's like, that's some beautiful, beautiful it's definitely pre-Weimar Germany architecture.
Yeah, actually, I think I just posted about the Reichstag before I got banned.
But yeah, it's that super, super famous picture. Like you can see these beautiful, beautiful, beautiful columns and statues and stuff, and it's just covered with vandalism.
Yeah, the thing about the Reichstag though is the Nazis burned it, and then the Soviets came and tagged over the burned building.
Yeah. I guess
Yeah.
that's what happens when you have two terrible regimes clashing with each other. It's just worse on worse.
Yeah, actually, that picture reminded me. One of my other like areas of research has been like Vikings, like Viking
Yep.
Age, and then like the graffiti that Vikings did when they were in like Istanbul or Constantinople, like on like 1,000-year-old buildings, like they like
Yep.
that they the equivalent of like uh, Hans was here or something
Yep.
on like these like 1,000-year-old churches. You're like, great. Like,
Yep.
all right, so I got one more controversial question, and I think
All
that
right.
so this one is more or less controversial. It's one of those things I think that there's not ever really going to be a real answer, and it's this idea of whether or not World War II should be considered one war or multiple wars, and broken down to like the different fronts. Like you could like the basically the European war would be like a European civil war, right? And
Right.
the war in Asia would be something similar, like an Asian civil war, and like the war in Northern Africa would be something similar, and then the war
Yep.
that would happen in like India, and that'd be like a completely other thing. So like it's like this idea that we break down like all the different like theaters basically into like separate wars, and that while they were all like occurring at the same time, like it doesn't necessarily work to group them all into um, this big broad umbrella of World War II, because like all these different conflicts were kind of happening for different reasons. Like the Japanese were killing Chinese for different reasons than the Germans were invading Poland. So does it really make sense to group them together even though they were allies? Um, what do you
Right.
think? What are your
Yeah.
thoughts?
I mean, personally, I think of them. I mean, yeah, it's all World War II, but I think of it as different conflicts because there are times where they actually seem like different conflicts. Like the war in North Africa was very different from the stalemate on the Eastern Front. And I feel like they almost should be considered separate conflicts just because there's so much going on that there are some things that just go unnoticed, like Japan invading China. Um,
Right.
I'm going to rope the Cold War into this because the Cold War often gets recognized as a war that didn't happen. Um, whereas there was so much going on in World War, like there was a ton of conflicts in Africa, in Asia, all over the place. And World War II gets it kind of just gets its fame from Asia and the Pacific, or not Asia and the Pacific, sorry, Asia and Europe, and you know the Italian front, um, and North Africa. I mean, some super serious World War II enthusiasts, you know, like to talk about them and stuff, but your average history enthusiast will kind of just think of World War II as, you know, Pearl Harbor, D-Day, invasion of France, that kind of stuff.
Right, and I think that's fair. And part of the reason, like, we think about World War II as like this one event is because like it's like usually like a week in high school history is most people's exposure to World War II, right? So like
Yep.
you can only teach so much in a week or two, and then like never revisit it again. So that's kind of like why people have this very like surface level understanding of World War II. It's like you were saying, it's like Pearl Harbor, and then D-Day, and then we dropped bombs, and then it was over. Like that's people's understanding of World War II. Like
Exactly.
I have to like part of my what I do is like actively work against that. Like there's a lot more to it. Like there's
Yeah.
allies and enemies, and and the U.S. involvement was 4 years military, but like 2 or 3 years before that supplying stuff. Like it's a much longer event than a 1 week in your history class, and it still has effects today on global politics, on like who's in charge of what countries. And like you could say that socialism in Europe is directly like tied to like being so anti-regime. Like
Yep.
there's very like the effects of World War II like can't be understated. But I think it's really dangerous to like really just like group it all into this like one big umbrella because the things that happened were so like spread out geographically, but also like on a time scale. Because I mean, like we were saying, like the first actions of World War II really could be like attributed to like the mid 30s, like Japanese invasions of China. Um,
Oh yeah.
but I don't. I really like to think about the war in the Pacific and the war in Europe being almost completely different. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I usually kind of group North Africa into the war in Europe, and I usually group everything going on in the Pacific to the war with Japan, even though like I mean like geographically like in the Pacific like the war was taking place like a 3,000-mile battlefield basically like
Oh yeah.
I mean the distance from Japan to Australia is like the distance from Japan to like the United States.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to like think about like that because we're so used to looking at a globe and it looks a lot closer than that, but it's really not.
Right. There's just so much going on at one point in time that people just, it's World
Right.
War II.
Right. And I mean, go ahead.
Well, and I was going to touch on your North Africa thing again. I also consider it war in Europe because there were the Germans, the Brits, and the Italians, and the Americans too. The Americans were there. And it also heavily influenced the invasion of Italy later on in the war. So I consider North Africa almost a side quest, if you will, to the European theater.
Honestly, like as a historian, I don't consider the war in North Africa to be done in 1945. I really don't see the war in North Africa being over until France loses its colonies, and I want to say that wasn't until the 70s. So the war in Africa is ongoing. Like it went on for a long. Actually, I think it was right before 1968. I think that was one of the reasons the big like French like civil uprisings in the 60s.
Yeah.
So
well, there's also something with France that was happening in Vietnam, but that's kind of a minor issue. And it's just might be a tiny minor footnote in history, sarcastically speaking, of course.
Yeah, I took a class on 1968 France, so I'm a little schooled up on that stuff. But it's neither here nor there. But
yeah,
I think it's really messy to like World War II was 1939 to 1945 because it was really like it started before that, and like you could like argue that the Cold War is really just an extension of that. So what that didn't really end till like 89. Like,
I mean, you can even think of it as World War II just being a continuation of a ceasefire after World War I.
Right.
The Cold War being the afterburn of the World War, if we're going to think about it in one big scope.
Yeah, I always like to think like, what would a World War like I veteran think like if he heard somebody refer to World War II, like between wars? They didn't even call World War I World War I until after World War II. So like, what if they heard somebody say like World War I like in 1920? They would have been like,
what?
Wait, there's another one.
I'm gonna have to do this again. Yeah.
No, your kids are.
Yep.
All right, I think we ate up our time on controversial topics. I really liked your answers. You got really involved. I appreciate that. I didn't have to do all the talking, which is really nice. All right, so
I was glad to be of assistance.
So you know what comes next in the show. We're going to talk about you, your account, what you're doing, why I chose you to be a guest on my super famous podcast. So, Milster Mariner, 100% of the people I surveyed, which was me, want to know, why do you keep changing the name of your account?
Okay, we're going to have to go all the way back to the beginning of my account, which was a little bit over a year ago. So originally I called myself, the name of the account was Surplus Boogaloo, and that did not have any tie-in with the Boog meme that came out a couple months later. Um, and it was a collaborative effort between myself and a friend, and he is really interested about First World War vehicles, planes and tanks, that kind of stuff. And it's like, hey, I have a bunch of this gear and I really want an outlet to talk about it. Do you want to kind of have an outlet to talk about all the stuff that you know so we can talk about it more than just on our little group chat that we have going? So we started that. A couple months later, we both split ways. We both went off to college, and I took over the account as its sole proprietor. And I changed the name to Surplus Luau, which was in correlation with the Boog meme before. It wasn't about liberty and it was about violence. And I kept that name because it was kind of catchy. It was short and sweet. And I could abbreviate it to SL, which a lot of people didn't have. And then some stuff happened, which I think is a question you're going to ask later regarding Luau Inc. And I changed my name again to avoid being lumped in with that former group to Milsurp Mariner, which I have been planning for a while. And I really don't like to change my name that much, just because if people see all of a sudden see Surplus Luau disappear and Milsurp Mariner come up, they're going to be like, who is this guy? And maybe they'll unfollow. I don't really care if people unfollow, but I like at least a little bit of retention. So that's a little bit of the history behind the name. And the name fits me a little bit better too. It kind of describes who I am.
That's interesting. Because I've been following you on my main account since you were Surplus Boogaloo, so a long time.
Yep.
But I don't know. This is some like deep true stories of World War II lore here. When I started this account with two other people. I don't think anybody knows that. I've never mentioned it anywhere before, but
Yep.
I quickly found out that one person wasn't producing the quality of content that I wanted, and I cut him out right away. And another person,
Yep.
he kind of just stopped producing content. So I mean, I throw a lot of people off when I use when I refer to the page as we, but originally there was 3 people. It's just me now, and it has been pretty much from the beginning, from the first month, I want to say. But no, I started the same way. This account was supposed to be multiple people, and I've still thought about that because posting every day is a lot of work. So I've thought about bringing in other people. Hey, you post on Saturdays, but I don't know. I think it would water down the brand a little bit. So
yeah, scheduling like that is hard. And I mean, I have a bit larger of a follower group than I did before, back when it was Surplus Boogaloo and it was 2 people. But if you scroll way down to the bottom of my account, back when I used to do a lot more history posts that are actually pretty similar to what you do, Holden, you can see that whenever we would respond to comments, we'd sign off as 2 different names because there are in fact 2 people. There was admin and myself, and then there was Scott, who was an alias of my friend who co-owned the account at the time. So whenever you'd see a picture of equipment, that was me. And then whenever you'd see a picture of some early German prototype tank or some Mexican armored vehicle from 1916, which is a thing, and I highly recommend you check it out on my page. For all those who are listening, you'll see that we sign off as different names because there were 2 people who used to run the account.
So I guess we already kind of edged into it. People want to know, man, what happened with Luau Inc. It seemed like you were kind of I don't know, I want to say you were leading the charge, but it kind of felt like it was named after you a little bit, and there was a lot of people involved. You want to give a quick description of what Luau Inc. was for the people that don't know, and then talk about what happened?
Yeah, so originally Luau Inc. was a group of 10 people, I think 10 Instagram gun pages. I was the only one that was a kind of Milsurp page. At the time, I didn't own anything newer than 1943. And it was a really cool group of people. We would just, talk about guns and gear and all sorts of other stuff in this chat. Just a bunch of really fun, liberty-loving people. Like we'd like do like all these like workout challenges and stuff like this, and it was a lot of fun for the first few months. And then the group chat started to get like people started to take themselves way too seriously, and no one likes that, especially in an Instagram group chat. And some people decided to cut themselves out. Some people were getting like super edgy, and it's like some people got banned from that group chat. And me and a couple other people, I was the last of these aforementioned people to leave, but we just ended up leaving because there were just a couple people in the group that we just couldn't put up with anymore. That's like, we don't want to waste our time with this anymore, and we're just gonna go peacefully from this. And shortly following that, the WWII page itself supposedly got banned and deleted. And I'm pretty sure it didn't, because the main people who left were the main content creators for that page. And after that, no posts were done. And all of a sudden, the page just disappears completely. And everyone was saying that it got banned. And me and a couple other people were like, it 100% didn't get banned.
Yeah.
So
Let me tell you, I'm an expert on being banned, and usually they don't just up and delete your account. Usually you just end up like me, where you can't post or comment or or follow. So
yeah, and I've been banned a few times, and I know for a fact that it just doesn't go straight up to randomly being deleted. Yeah. Like I've gotten threats of being deleted, but my account's never been just completely just vaporized.
I think I appreciate you giving your point of view on that. I don't want to like put you out there in bad standing with the other people, but I think people are curious because it seemed to be like for a while there it was really taken off, and like a lot of people were talking about it.
I mean, it was a bigger page than mine was. Pretty sure it ended with around 2,000 followers, which is pretty good for an account that posted like once every other week.
Yeah, it's not bad.
Yeah, that's the short version of a very juicy story.
Well, I know as well as anybody that working with other creators isn't always easy. I've had multiple partnerships on this account that they aren't currently going on, so that should give you a key. I try to work with other creators. That's kind of what the podcast is about, but it's not always easy.
Yeah.
Also, keynote here, people don't always get my sarcasm, but you reminded me like when you were saying that people take themselves too seriously. Anytime like you think that I'm taking myself too seriously, I'm like 100% kidding. Just so you know. I'm very sarcastic, and people don't always like get it. But like when I refer to this as like a super popular podcast, I'm well aware there's less than 100 people listening right now, and like we're towards the end of the video. There's even less than that. Like I'm not kidding myself. I have to have a little bit of fun with it. Like I can't take this stuff too seriously. So.
I mean, I post pictures of myself in short shorts and pit vipers on Instagram, and you can't take that seriously.
Yeah, and I posted a picture of a high point on my story not that long ago. So, all right, man, that's enough. I don't want to talk too much about this depressing stuff. Let's move into, I guess a question. We already kind of got into it. Like you said your name now like more reflects you, and that's because you've been working on a merchant mariner license. Can you describe what merchant Marines or merchant mariner is? I don't really have a great understanding, and I'm sure not everybody listening does.
Absolutely. I'm sure once I explain, it'll just instantly click. It's like, oh yeah, I know who those people are. So merchant mariners are American civilians who operate merchant ships, and our flag says in peace and in war. And I think the most famous involvement of the merchant marines was in World War II. The Liberty ships were crewed by merchant mariners, and it was the highest death toll per capita out of every theater, Europe, Pacific. The Battle of the Atlantic was especially brutal. Like ships were just going down left and right, and submarine warfare is just horrible. And the merchant mariners were the ones who were facing the submarines head on, Japanese kamikazes, etc. But they're the ones who were supplying everybody with the supplies they needed. Um, and right now, I'm going to college for that. I study marine transportation operations, which is the navigation above deck side of that kind of stuff. And when I graduate, I will have a Coast Guard unlimited tonnage third mate's license. My
That's a
school
lot
will
of
remain
words.
unnamed. It is a lot of words. It's a lot of stuff too. But yeah, so training to one day become the captain of a merchant ship. Not quite sure if I want to go cargo or oil or cruise or what be it, but I really love being able to tie my career to the Liberty ships because it's such an interesting footnote of the war.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess it makes sense now that you explain it, like you said. And I think a lot of people relate to that, like wanting to like tie themselves to World War II. Like I joined the military because I wanted to be tied to the people that were in the military before me. So that makes sense.
Right.
Um,
And in the courtyard of my school, there's a it's now I'm forgetting the size of it. It's the cannon that would go on the stern of a Liberty ship, and because during the war, the midshipmen at the college that I go to, um, they had a whole naval gunnery class where this gun sat out on the pier, and they would shoot blanks and reduce loads into the ocean to practice shelling submarines from the stern of a Liberty ship.
it's pretty interesting.
Yep, definitely not something you see every day.
Oh, so I want to get in a little bit here. I kind of like run out of time to be honest, but we're going to talk fast about
Cool.
what do you do on Instagram now? We kind of talked about your past Instagram, like your past affiliations, who you worked with, what you've done, but what are you currently doing on Instagram?
What I'm currently doing on Instagram is I take pictures of old guns and old stuff that I have, and I write a very either straight up garbage or witty or either informative. It's one of the three. It can't be all of them at once. Caption about whatever it is. I'll be at the range or something, and I'll like lean my SMLE or my number 4 against the side of my truck or something, and I'll be like, oh, that's cool, and I'll take a picture of it. And then I'll write something like, I think a post, I was holding my SMLE and I said the SMLE in the sunset, and it's like, okay, content, cool. And then on my story, my story is where a lot of content that I like goes. So that's where I post a lot of other people's content that I enjoy and I feel like other people should see. But yeah, that's pretty much what I do. I don't really have a posting schedule. I kind of just post like when I see an opportunity to take a picture, I'll post it. Haven't been to any good museums in a while, but I have a ton of pictures from the National World War I Museum in Kansas City that I was at a few years ago that I still haven't gotten around to posting, but I hope to eventually. But yeah, I used to be real themed and coordinated with my posting, and that just got real tiring.
Yeah.
And so then I just started posting, it's like, here's a picture of this and here's a picture of that. And, that kind of stuff. I post what I like. I'm not really afraid of what other people have to say about it.
That's fair. I, for anybody still listening, when we come back after this ban, our posting is probably going to be a lot less strict than it has been in the past, to be honest with you. Not being able to post the last couple days has kind of just led me to realize that maybe I shouldn't take the schedule so seriously and maybe just post more what I'm currently working on. And we'll see. I'm reworking things. Stay tuned. Let's see. What about future goals on Instagram? What's your goal in the short term, the long term, whatever?
I mean, I hate to say it, but I'm kind of just on Instagram to have an outlet to talk about what I like, honestly. Like, I don't really care about the follower count or the likes. I kind of just like an opportunity to show what I have and talk to other people about what they have. Because
That's fair.
you can't really do that anywhere else right now.
Right.
It's a great place for like-minded people to collaborate and stuff. And I've met a lot of really cool people on here that otherwise I would have met if I just kept these thoughts to myself.
That's fair. I 100% get that. I've met a lot of great people on Instagram too. Um, a lot of them are going to be on here in the next couple of weeks. I got Old Mauser Man and Black Sheep coming up. I'm really excited to have both those people on here. I met them both on Instagram. I met you on Instagram. I met World War II Junkie on Instagram. So I totally get it. I think that's probably the part I enjoy the most too, is working with other collectors. And we're getting back to that now with the podcast. And I hope to be able to tie in some more posts eventually with other people. We know when I first got my start, I did a lot of work with other people, and we've kind of gotten away from that a little bit, just because like it's a lot of work to collaborate with other people and like line up your schedules and stuff. But I think it's worth it. I think we like produce better stuff on Instagram when we work together. So.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Let's see what else. So we kind of already mentioned you got a couple Enfields. What's it with the Enfields, man? Like, do you?
I'm gonna try and be as brief with this as possible. I got into history way back in the day, back when I was in middle school, a long time ago, and from there, I had a really deep appreciation for military history, even though some people would consider it normie. If you look really deep into it, there's some super elaborate stuff going on. And from there, it's like, I've been shooting the occasional like pellet gun and 22 every now and then. But these black powder rifles are something that I can get and something that people shoot. And these things are really cool. And I can almost experience history myself. So I grew up competing all over my home state in various black powder rifle events. And it was a lot of fun. That was kind of my gateway into historic firearms. I started out with one that I built. That was my first competition rifle. I then moved on to a really nice reproduction pattern 1863 Enfield short musket. That one has moved on because I just didn't want it anymore. It didn't really have as much importance to me as the one that I built, which was my first one. And then from there, I started to get more into more modern history and realized it's like I can actually have a piece of modern history in my hands instead of having a reproduction. And from there, I got into bayonet collecting and then rifle collecting. And then I've always been into British Commonwealth history. That's the long and the short of it. So why not get a Lee Enfield or two?
Fair. Yeah, I mean, I've got an MK4 too, so I can't talk.
They're great rifles.
Yeah, I love mine. American-made Savage arms. I got the Canadian spike bayonet. Pretty rare, actually.
Mm-hmm. I managed to accidentally get my Canadian spike bayonet.
Me too.
There's this gun. Yeah. There's a gun store that I frequent a couple hours away from me that I get my old guns from because they specialize in it. And I was buying my number 4 there, and they're like, "We have a few bayonets in the back. Do you want one?" And I was so excited, and I was just like, "Yeah, sure." And I totally forgot about that. There's different markings, different types. So they just handed me one. Then a couple weeks later, I'm like, I wonder what this is. So I looked at it, I'm like, oh, it's a Canadian one. It matches my rifle. Neat.
Yeah, I got mine accidentally too. I bought it with the rifle, and actually it doesn't match the rifle because 1, the rifle's American, 2, the bayonet's Canadian, and the Canadian ones are produced after World War II. So it doesn't exactly work, but it is what it is. Yeah. So man, like, I'm gonna wrap things up a little bit here. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I got a couple business things I got to run through really quick here, and then we're gonna get closing remarks from you. First of all, I gotta run over who's coming up next. Like I said, I'm supposed to record with Old Mauser Man tomorrow. I think we're gonna kind of break the mold. We're not gonna talk about controversial history. I know, gasp, right? But it's going to be really interesting. I've been looking forward to shooting with him for a couple weeks. Really looking forward to it. I'm supposed to shoot with Black Sheep on Saturday. I'm not going to be in my studio then, so stay tuned. We're going to figure out how exactly to make that work. And I'm supposed to shoot with surplus and stuff next week. I'm currently still working on getting a couple more people scheduled in here. I'm looking at getting some people I served with in the military on. I think that'd be kind of interesting. One of my friends is a doc, and I got a couple friends who are active duty Marines, and I've got a couple friends who've been moving from one branch to the other branch, and I get plenty of people on from the military. I got to figure out what direction I want to go. We're still working on that. Obviously, we're still working the kinks out of the podcast. It is what it is. If you made it this far, you're along for the ride, so I don't really care. One more plug for what we got going on for sponsoring. Basically, this new sponsorship program I've been working out is in direct response to my last podcast. I kind of announced that I'd really like to have sponsors for these because it's not cheap to be doing all this Instagram stuff and YouTube stuff and Spotify stuff and Anchor stuff. Like, it's all out of pocket. So like, if people want to kick in $1 or $2, I really appreciate it. It goes a long way. But if you want to kick in $1, I'll shout you out. If you want to kick in $5, I'll shout you out and send you a sticker. If you want to send more money my way, we'll figure some other way to appreciate you. We'll work something out. I'm fair, I promise. I'd really like, the more like sponsorship we get, the more I can put into getting some real merch made, like t-shirts, because the startup to make t-shirts is going to be like $1,200 or something crazy like that. So yeah, I mean, all these things are possible with sponsorships. I'd really like to get a sponsorship of a real company someday, but we gotta work with what we got right now. And unfortunately, that's just listeners. I love you guys. I don't mean to like pester you for like donations, but every bit helps, and I really appreciate it. That's all I got on sponsoring. If you don't want to send $1 my way, don't worry about it. I still love you. Just keep listening to the podcast and shouting us out on Instagram and liking our posts and sending me direct messages. I love hearing from you people. Comment on these posts, like them, share them with your friends. That's it. Thank you so much. Milsert Mariner, do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, I just want to thank you for having me. This was awesome. I honestly never would have imagined that, through Instagram, I would have been able to do this. It's a fantastic opportunity. And I was glad to be on one of your first podcasts.
It was great to have you. I always appreciate the kind things people have to say about me, because I just think about myself as any other dude on Instagram, and that's all I really am. Anybody can find minor success if you find a consistent posting schedule. So that's what I'm going to leave with you guys with today. Tune in next time with Old Mauser Man. It should be a good one. Not that this one wasn't. We'll see you then.